They're defending and fighting the right of bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, to make unilateral decisions about how to spend taxpayer dollars, and they're doing so in a way that's abusive and ridiculous, and everybody sees it.
Welcome to RealClearPolitics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, and Richard Porter, sitting in for Andy Walworth. Richard's a contributor to RealClearPolitics, a former RNC committeeman from Illinois, and a recovering lawyer. So, Richard, good to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
All right. Let's start with the news of the day, which clearly is all about Donald Trump and his plan to take over the Gaza Strip and make it the Riviera of the Mediterranean. Carl, what do you make of this? Is this, I mean, listen, Trump has come up with some, ideas that are, let's say, out of the box. This might be the most out of the box idea that we've heard from the president.
Well, Tom, that's Peter Baker of the New York Times, a reporter I know well. We covered the Bill Clinton presidency together all those years. And you're channeling Peter Baker. His lead in the New York Times on Wednesday morning was President Trump basked as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel praised his willingness to think outside the box. But when it came to Gaza, Mr. Trump's thinking on Tuesday was so far outside the box that it was not clear he even knew there was a box.
That's the best kind of out of the box thinking. I was on the edge of the Gaza Strip. I literally was, 100 feet from the border of the Gaza Strip in May. And you could see the settlements, a mile away. And there was a lot of destruction. And at the time, I actually went to a dinner with some government leaders. And I said, guys, look, I'm from Chicago. And if you know, in Chicago, it was created after the fire. They pushed all the rubble into the lake, and they put some topsoil over it, and they expanded Chicago out into the lake. And so much of what we think about Chicago is actually landfill from a fire. What you need to do is you need to bulldoze all of that rubble out into the Mediterranean Sea, make a nice little island, put some nice topsoil on there, and make that the new home of the people who are terrorists and want to keep on terrorizing Israel. Let them go live on an island off the coast. That was a little radical for the government officials I was speaking to.
They didn't like that, Richard?
Tom, Richard's giving me an idea.
I think I was pre-channeling Trump there. I was
or Jared Kushner, because I found out only recently there are only 2 golf courses in Israel. What about putting an island and making it a golf course, Richard? Because Trump wants to make it the Riviera of the Mediterranean. Well, that would be next level.
Well, but seriously, guys, it's sort of an interesting piece of history. I mean, the Gaza Strip has been under the control over the last thousands of years of the Egyptians, the Philistines. It was part of the Ottoman Empire for many years. The British took over the mandate, and then the Egyptians occupied it in the 48 War. And they were controlling that through until 67. So that piece of land, but they wouldn't let the people who live there, who were under their control, become Egyptians. Right. Although Egypt was, this whole region, the borders were shifting all the time. So Gaza is a piece of real estate that has been, in many hands over many centuries. And there is no distinct, history for this land and, what it is and what it's supposed to be. So it is out of the box because, I think the idea of embracing this is, people think, well, my goodness, now it's all going to be our problem. But, the reality is you need to change the culture so profoundly there. And the UN simply was reinforcing the kind of bad culture that was leading to the events of October 7th. So, sometimes the best way to manage a problem is to really take ownership of it. And then you can really change things as opposed to this arm's length thing, give it to the UN, and then have them turn it over to Hamas. So
okay. Well, hold on a second. So, Carl, I want to come to you on this. Like, Richard makes a point. I mean, why hasn't Jordan or Egypt, why haven't they taken in Palestinians, not just in recent times, but over the last, decades as this problem has gone on? And is that such a bad idea that you ask some of these countries in the region to, take us, maybe they don't take all 1.9 million or however many there are, but to have some ownership of this, because up until now they've been sort of hands off, saying, look, we don't want any of these refugees.
Well, Jordan took a lot of them in a couple of different tranches after these wars Richard's talking about, and they almost destabilized, the government. This is a restive group of people who feel that that Israel is their rightful home, and they've been radicalized over generations now. I mean, Israel was created in 1948. These people have been, generation after generation, have been taught to hate Israel. It's not on the maps of their country. In the last 2 decades, since the time Richard's talking about, when Israel pulled out of Gaza, Hamas has gone in there. First Saudi Arabia, and then later the Iranians, pay these very radical mullahs to go there. The schools, the educational system preaches hate. Well, it's taken root. And, Trump ruminating the way he does, he thinking aloud. We're not used to presidents doing that. And Richard's right. I mean, we do need, something has to change other than the status quo. But you can't wish 1.9 million people away. The Arab countries aren't going to take them. And so the only solution there is what Richard said. It's a culture change, but it's not going to look, removing people forcibly. They were already removed in their minds from Israel. Remove them again is going to bring on another 60 years of hate. You need to change the culture, but you need to maybe tie the aid to some reform, political reform, and those people have to be made to feel that they have a stake in where they live. If you're going to turn it into the Riviera of the Mediterranean, those people have to own part of it. They're not going to be moved. That's a war crime. That's ethnic cleansing. They're going to be there, and they have to be invested in this, profit from it, and see a better future. That the United States can help do that, but let's not pretend we can just move them somewhere.
Okay,
That's my view.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, I think ethnic cleansing is sort of a loaded term. I'm not sure if Trump's proposing killing them. He might be proposed, relocating them, which maybe forced relocation is considered.
It's pretty much close. It's pretty close to a war crime, Tom. So.
Well, but it is interesting, Carl, because so many of the countries that Trump is talking about encouraging the residents of that piece of geography to move to are countries that have been the source of emigration out of those countries into Europe. And to some extent, it's kind of what goes around comes around. I mean, if you're going to be shipping your people into Western Europe, is it really so unjust to say, you know what, you've been shipping people out, you're going to take some people for a while. And by the way, there is no big ethnic difference there between the people living in Gaza and the people living a few, miles away in Egypt. They were under common rule for hundreds of years. And then again, most recently through until the 1967 war. So, I mean, the idea that somehow you say to Egypt, look, this was your problem. You occupied this. You didn't absorb them before. You made a mistake. You should absorb them now. It's different, right? But when you kind of lay it out like that, I don't think it's quite as shocking as it seems.
Okay, but Richard, hold on. What is shocking is Donald Trump, who ran for office on this sort of America for people would call it, non-interventionist, isolationist, whatever, not getting involved in catastrophic foreign wars or entanglements. And yet here he turns around and proposes that the United States take control of this piece of land, which has been just an absolute intractable problem for decades. And by the way, Lindsey Graham even said, look, I think it's problematic. I don't think my constituents are going to vote for that or want to see us, pouring money and resources and manpower into the Middle East. So what's going on with Donald Trump? Isn't this contrary?
Wait, Tom, it's like John Kerry in the Iraq War. Donald Trump was against nation building before he was for it.
But what about that, Richard? I mean, doesn't this just strike a hugely discordant tone with his America First foreign policy that he's been espousing for years?
I think that there's an element of it that does, but let's recognize too that what else he's doing is he's pulling out of these UN organizations through which we are funneling money ineffectively into this region and fostering some of this problem. And if you basically are reprogramming the money that was going through these multilateral institutions like the UN, human rights organizations and, WHO and so forth, and instead put it into a direct action to make some changes because we can't trust the UN to do the right job, it gets us more involved in one sense, but not really because we've already been involved through the UN, if that makes.
Tom, that point Richard's making is right. It's one of the shocking things since October 7th invasion by Hamas of Israel has been how many UN workers are actually members of Hamas.
Yeah.
Our money shouldn't be going to terrorists. I think and that would be a winning proposition for most Americans.
That would be a winning proposition, but again, I'm not sure how much the MAGA base, people who are fervently supportive of Trump because of his idea that, hey, we're not going to spend all this money abroad when we could be spending it at home taking care of our own people. We don't want to be funding wars in Ukraine and all these crazy projects before funding the needs of our own people. And so suddenly here he is. Well, we're gonna now. I know the White House said, look, this isn't going to involve boots on the ground. It's not even going to involve like Americans paying for it, the American tax dollars. But okay, whatever. I'm not sure I believe that. I get it. I see Donald Trump as a developer, Richard, and he can clearly see that's a valuable, could be a really paradise and a valuable strip of land to put up all these hotels, great Trump Tower right there on the Mediterranean.
Well,
would do big business. However, would also be, it's kind of a fantasy idea that if this were to materialize, that this wouldn't be a magnet for terror attacks and people saying, oh, this is a symbol of American imperialism and colonialism and racism, and it wouldn't be rainbows and unicorns as in this paradise as Trump probably envisions it.
Well, let's just also recognize there's another possibility here, which is that Trump is trolling the people in Gaza and Arab nations, because he's basically saying, look, I could make that into a paradise. And so the negative kind of unspoken part is, why haven't you? This is a garden spot. You could do so much with this. You could make this Beirut, but instead you dig tunnels with the money that comes in and you sow terror and teach your children to kill. And so I think that there's also a possibility here that this is another it's a challenge by Trump to an established regime in a way that highlights how badly they've been doing. Do you know what I mean? By saying, I could take this over, I can make this better. And so it's basically saying, why can't you? Because you're hateful and incompetent, right? That's the bottom line. And so, look, if the Gazans want to make that as well, then do it. You know what I mean? Stop digging tunnels. Make it a beautiful place. It's a challenge.
Carl, another aspect of this is, I remember George W. Bush, when he was talking about Iraq, he'd always say he's going to assemble a coalition of the willing. What is this an opportunity for Trump to do, as he did with the Abraham Accords, to go to other countries and say, look, it's not just America. I know he said at the press conference, look, we'll own it and we'll do it. But why couldn't he go to Egypt and Jordan and UAE and all these other players in the region and say, listen, let's get together and let's do this and let's fundamentally change the dynamic of what's going on in the Middle East. So it's not an American imperial colonial project. It's I don't want to say like a global project, but it certainly would be a partnership among interested parties in the region who could really transform that area.
I thought you were going to use the word multinational for a minute there, Tom.
I did not. It's a dirty word. No, I'm kidding.
Listen, even before Trump won re-election, before people knew that he was going to would come back to the White House, when people thought first Joe Biden would win, maybe Kamala Harris, we didn't know how the election was going to come out. The people who looked at this talked about what you and Richard are talking about, that if you were really going to get rid of Hamas and rebuild Gaza, it would have to be the Saudis would have to play a key role, these other countries. And there wasn't a thought that the United States would lead it, maybe help fund it, but not lead it for the reasons you've cited. And maybe President Trump is trying to jumpstart that process, but that the future of Gaza is going to be an international future. You just can't let a terrorist organization run it. We've seen what that produces, and America's not going to go in there and run it. So I think what you guys are saying is where this is headed.
All right, we are going to take a quick break. We're going to be back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM right after this. Welcome back to RealClear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief, and Richard Porter, who is a contributor to RCP and a former RNC committeeman from the great state of Illinois. Carl, we've been following and tracking all of the nominees for Trump's cabinet, but let's start with the latest news, which is Pam Bondi, who was confirmed as Attorney General just the other day, turned right around and said her first act of business as Attorney General was to shut off all the money to sanctuary cities in the U.S. What do you make of that move? And what do you think Pam Bondi as Attorney General? Is this a different? We've had Eric Holder said he was Obama's wingman, and we've got the Attorney General is theoretically supposed to be independent, or maybe they're not supposed to be independent.
Yeah.
Certainly, Bobby Kennedy wasn't independent from his brother JFK. So, what do you make of Pam Bondi as the new Attorney General?
Well, I've always thought that was a problematic construction. The Attorney General, Joe Biden was very clear about this, and the context was, William Barr, and they didn't want to, they didn't want to be accused of politicizing justice, which they were accused of anyway. But he said, Merrick Garland will have, I won't even talk to him. We won't have any input. We'll just follow the law. And there were two problems with that. First of all, I don't think it was true. I think they cooperated closely with the White House, and we'll find that out in the fullness of time. The second thing is, though, Tom, as a constitutional matter, I find it very problematic. The Attorney General is in the executive branch. He's appointed by the president. Nobody ever voted for president for Merrick Garland. We don't know what Merrick Garland stood for. We don't really know what Pam Bondi didn't run for office. The Attorney General is not supposed to be completely independent. You're not supposed to do the stuff Richard Nixon did, which is threaten people's careers and, get them to lie under oath. That's not what they're supposed to do. But it's a delicate relationship that has to be handled with some integrity, but it shouldn't be completely independent. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Other people feel differently. Pam Bondi was so conservative and so pro-Trump. When CBS on Tuesday morning, when she was confirmed, or Wednesday morning, George Stephanopoulos said Pam Bondi was Attorney General of Florida and a close Trump ally and an election denier. He just threw that in there. Stephanopoulos, I guess, I don't know if they may have to pay another $15 million. I don't know. But my point is that if Tulsi Gabbard and Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Pete Hegseth had not been nominated, Pam Bondi might have caused liberals' hair to go on fire in the Senate. But she seemed like rational in their minds comparatively, so she was approved. But she's clearly qualified. She was Attorney General of Florida. She was close to Trump. She can't unilaterally block all federal money to go into sanctuary cities. But this is another, move that the Trump administration has taken in this whirlwind, these first 3 weeks, to say it's not going to be business as usual, and you're not going to be able to defy federal law. And really, the Democrats don't want to have that argument. That was settled during the Civil War, and the Democrats, they're always saying so and so's on the wrong side of history. They don't want to be on the wrong side of history. They don't want to be emulating the Southern secessionists and saying that the federal government, can't control its own money and that local officials can defy federal law. That's not really where they want to be. So the administration is going to get some traction with this, I think. I see Richard nodding his head. Am I right?
Well, listen, hold on a second.
Okay.
First of all, I'm glad you made that ABC joke, because if you didn't make it, I was going to. But Richard, one of the reasons that Pam Bondi sort of sailed through, and Carl mentioned this, but he didn't mention your buddy Matt Gaetz.
Be an asshole. Dude, I don't even know who you are, man.
Who is probably the reason that she was seen as a really viable alternative.
Right, there was a sigh of relief.
Yeah, well, so I know you have been a lawyer for a long time, and I guess my question to you, if you know Pam Bondi, feel free to talk about her, but my question to you is, as we've seen this administration make moves, and this is a move that Pam Bondi is making, I'm sure it's going to be met with a host of lawsuits, right? As the Dems have filed lawsuits against Doge, and I'm sure they're going to file. So how much traction will some of these lawsuits get in your mind? And will they slow the momentum, the early momentum of this administration? I know it's like 5 questions in one, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let me go through a couple of things. I want to just reinforce what Carl said, which is the Constitution vests all of the executive power under the Constitution in a single person, and that's the president, who's elected by all the people. So he's 100% right. The idea that somehow the Justice Department is independent within the executive branch is just not true. He works or she works for the president. And so part of that whole conceit that Merrick Garland was really independent was a way to mask the politicization of the exercise of judgment and justice. And it's far better. You'll get less politics if people embrace the reality that the president is standing behind what his or her attorney general is doing. And so it's important to recognize that she does work for Trump. She is the lawyer for the executive branch that he heads as president. She is not his personal lawyer, but she is the lawyer representing the interests of this president and his policies. And so it's not like there's any other, the independent branch of government assessing legal matters is the judiciary, right? And so people can sue if they disagree. If they think that the exercise of power is too extensive, people can sue who have standing, and then you have an independent branch to look at that and to assess the law. So the rule of law is still a concept. I mean, everybody's bound by the rule of law, and it's the judges who are enforcing it. But the president's lawyer, the president's attorney general, and I say the president not in the individual sense, but in the executive sense, in the sense of the position, that's a person that's in a they're allowed to have a position. They're not independent. And so then to the question of the exercise of power we saw today, I think that it's pretty well settled that if the funds are closely tied or close enough tied, I think there's a matter of judgment with that, towards what the policy is you're trying to implement, then you can hold back funds, right? So in other words, if I say, and of course, it's the Democrats who have extended this exercise of executive power, using money, tying purse strings to try to get states and localities to do things. So you can tie money towards civil rights things and that sort of thing. And of course, this is, in some sense, a civil right enforcement action. It's a right enforcing the very basic civil rights of Americans to be safe, right? So to tie justice funds that go to the city of Chicago and say, look, if you're not going to cooperate with us in terms of rounding up criminals, well, we're not going to give you any more Justice Department grants. I think that's a layup to get enforced. Okay, so I don't know the full scale of the funding that has been blocked as a result of this, and I imagine there's some outer bound that there may be an issue. But these are very smart people. They've encountered this challenge before, and so I think that they'll be aggressive about what they can do, because frankly, it's ridiculous for a city of Chicago, as Carl said, the idea that some locality can thumb their nose at the federal government operating within the scope of its authority. We have a federal government, which has enumerated powers. The states have the other powers. But when the federal government operates within the zone of its enumerated powers, it is supreme. It is supreme. And so the idea that the state or locality can thumb their nose and say, no, we're not going to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1865 or that sort of thing, right? And that's the problem we had with the southern states. All the way, by the way, they were all Democrats thumbing their nose at the change in policy with regard to civil rights. And it's the same thing here. There's a clear change in policy with immigration. We're going to enforce the immigration laws now. If they don't play along, they should expect to lose their money.
Carl, what about this battle over USAID and theoretically other stuff that may be coming down the pike? I mean, we had a couple of stories on RealClearPolitics this morning about this. Is the Democrats have said, and we saw the clips of them standing out in front of there chanting, Chuck Schumer's joined hands with Maxine Waters, and we will not rest, we will win, I mean, on and on and on. But they are saying essentially we are at war. This is a constitutional crisis that the administration is now doing things, taking control of spending that was authorized by Congress, and they are usurping their power in trying to, make revisions or reductions or eliminating offices or programs. And this is a constitutional crisis. Do you think that is that is that true? Is that legitimate? Is that where this thing is headed? Or is this kind of a, sort of a bit of grandstanding on the part of Democrats, and that the Trump administration and Elon Musk and Doge are within their rights to do what they've been doing?
Well, I'll give you my view, and I'd be curious what Richard says. He's a lawyer. I think the Democrats are half right. I don't think USAID is a government agency formed by Congress, signed into law by a president, and to just make it go away, which is what the Trump administration seems to want to do. And what they claim, well, yeah, it's going to go away. And the next day, well, but Rubio will be in charge of it, but it's really going away anyway. I don't think that doesn't strike me as good government. It may be problematic. The Democrats challenge it in court. I don't know what the result of that will be, but we've seen this spate of stories. A $70,000 expenditure for a transgender puppet show in Serbia. I mean, kind of goofy examples. But a fraction of the spending of AID, which most of it is foreign aid, most of it going to countries either that we want to prop up the administration because we want that government to survive, or, going to poor people in poor countries who have no way of even feeding themselves, let alone getting, operations and medical care. And the idea that, what the Trump administration should do, in my opinion, is go through the books and get rid of all the crap that they think doesn't fulfill AID's legitimate mission, its statutory mission, or stuff that they just think is wasteful. And, you can cut the agency in half if we're spending too much money. But to just say you're going to get rid of it because of a tiny fraction of the money, tiny fraction, strikes me as bad policy, bad politics, and may not even be legal. So the Democrats, look, they're playing to their base, but they're not without merit in what they're saying. That's my view.
Richard, what do you think? Is this within the purview of the administration to do what they've been doing?
Yeah, I think it is. And by the way, Carl, I don't think it's a small fraction, a tiny fraction. I think what we've uncovered is a cultural problem. And this is the deep state, how it operates. You say to yourself, well, there is a legitimate basis for some foreign aid, some humanitarian aid, but then they mask that to push other political agendas. And apparently it's been an open secret in Washington that some of what the USAID does is sort of backdoor CIA stuff too, working with the CIA. So I think a house cleaning is totally in order. And it goes back to the point that in the Constitution, we have three co-equal branches, right? Congress creates laws. It's up to the executive to implement those laws. And there's an entire theory of executive power that goes to the idea that Congress cannot limit the means by which the president executes the law, that it's ultimately the president's responsibility to execute the law, and that the Congress, as a co-equal branch, not a superior branch, cannot, tie the president's hands in terms of how he executes and enforces the law. So
Wait, Richard, let me ask you a question about that, because that goes to the heart of it. Suppose Congress passed a law and said we're going to create a new national park in the state of Kansas. And President Trump said, great, Kansas should have a new national park. He signed this law. And then a new president came in, a Democrat, Wes Moore, Gavin Newsom, whoever, and said, no, we're getting rid of that national park. We're not going to have that national park. Would you really think that was acceptable constitutionally?
No, because I don't think that's enforcing the law. So, so for example,
what if you shrunk it by 90%?
It's structured. Yeah. So I think, in other words, I think that what this theory goes to is that if Congress gives, a mandate to the president that you shall, help veterans, but in the course of doing veterans, you may only provide health care in such and such a way, and let's say it's only with white hospitals or something, right? Or white-run hospitals. It seems that the president can, if he believes it's going to be more efficient, he can say, no, I'm not just going to choose individual hospitals. I can redirect some of the funding in this way. That there's some inherent power when it comes to implementing the law, that it's not for the collective group. This is what we came out of. This is how the Constitution was created, because originally we had a weak president whose hands were tied and directed by Congress, right? That was sort of the original structure. And they found that didn't work. And so that this is a reaction to the idea that Congress can be too involved in deciding how the law will be executed. So what are the outer bounds of that, Carl? I think we don't know. I mean, I think the more it looks like Congress is dictating. So for example, Congress in, I think, 2018 or that time frame, somewhere like that, maybe it was 22, passed a law that said that USAID may not be restructured without the consent of Congress. I just read about that this morning. I think that's the sort of thing that starts tying the president's hands, starts saying to the president, you can't run USAID. You cannot go in and reform USAID. But that can't be. It cannot be that the president is prevented from reforming a corrupt organization, right? I mean, that's so contrary to the idea of having, a government that works for the people at the end of the day. It is ultimately Congress passes the law, but it's the president who implements it, and Congress can't say, thou shalt not root out corruption and inefficiency, right? They are in such a losing position. Think about where the Democrats are. They are protesting in support of sending money for comic books promoting a certain idea of sex to Honduras or wherever that Central American country was where they did that. That is the worst place in the world for them to be. It's nuts. They're defending and fighting the right of bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, to make unilateral decisions about how to spend taxpayer dollars, and they're doing so in a way that's abusive and ridiculous, and everybody sees it. The president's on the right side of this thing, I think.
All right, we got to stop there. We've gone long once again. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be back with more right after this. Welcome back to RealClearPolitics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. In discussion today with Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief and executive editor, and Richard Porter, who is a contributor to RealClearPolitics and a former RNC committeeman from the state of Illinois. Gentlemen, Richard, let me start with you on this one, because this is, you and I both live in Chicago, and I've been there for 25, 26, 27 years. You've probably been there just as long. And we've watched this city progress from administration to administration, all Democrat, by the way, but from sort of a centrist, Mayor Daley, Richard Daley. He wasn't the cleanest mayor ever, but the trains ran on time. The city was prosperous and I think functioned well. And then you had, Mayor Emanuel, Lori Lightfoot, and now to Brandon Johnson. And we have a piece on RealClear Investigations, ran it on RealClearPolitics, talking about how the city is now effectively in a showdown with the Chicago's teachers union, of which, Mayor Brandon Johnson is closely tied.
He is their sock puppet. Let's face it. He is their sock puppet.
Okay, that's a more derisive term.
Yes,
but look, certainly he has been a close ally. He used to be a teacher. He's been part of that.
He was their lobbyist.
Yeah, and
his election was bought and paid for by the CTU.
They actually did spend a lot of money to help him win election in a close election, by the way. And so he is in many ways beholden to them, and he has been involved in some very dramatic moves, trying to fire the CEO of the Chicago Public Schools and install, his own folks. So what do you make of the situation now that exists in Chicago, where the teachers union, again, I remember the battles that Rahm Emanuel, he said he was going to have and had with the teachers unions. He ended up getting rolled by them. I mean, the teachers union seem to win every time they go. They've gone to battle with a mayor that's not not friendly to them, let alone one who is friendly to them.
Yeah, look, the idea that the CTU might go on strike again for a 15% raise is obscene. They're pushing the limits of their popularity. They still maintain about a 40% approval rating among the citizens of Chicago, but Mayor Brandon Johnson is the most unpopular mayor ever at 14%. And that's because people recognize that he's not there for the people. Chicago used to be called the city that works. Chicago is a city that doesn't work, or at least it's a city that works against the citizens of Chicago, and they see it. And it's just, for the first time, I think there's a light shining through in the recognition that the kind of the governance structure in Chicago does not work for the people. And what's happening in the schools is abysmal. It's absolutely abysmal. We're talking about the Gazan children. The idea that we have kids in Chicago, I think it's at 15 schools, none of whom can read or do math at grade level. And these are predominantly schools that serve Black and Hispanic kids. That's just wrong. It's wrong, and it shouldn't be happening, and we're letting it happen. And this power structure is so caught up with sucking money out for the constituencies of the Democratic Party that they're not willing to actually do things that make the city work. It's appalling. I thought the piece was terrific, and I think people ought to go back and take a look at what you guys put on the site this
that's
morning.
this piece in Real Clear Investigations, Tom. It suggests that there's a crack in the teachers union, that the teachers union itself doesn't really want to bankrupt the city, that a critical mass of teachers, and it goes into the structures by which the hierarchy of the union can, basically keeps the rank and file from power, from exercising this power, from weighing in. Tom, you live there. Richard lives there, so I'll give really brief an outsider's perspective. It's Brandon Johnson seems to this outsider just being over his head. And that's what I'd say. But it's the mystery to me is why the teachers union want to bankrupt the city of Chicago. I don't get that, because the end result of that would be a takeover of the schools by the state. And I'm maybe you guys can shed some light on it, but what they're asking for, they took $200 million that they were given in COVID money and just hired a bunch more teachers and administrators, demanded raises, got raises. They spent this money. Now the money's run out because the COVID money's run out. And if sanctuary cities are cut off, more money's going to be running out. But I don't understand what the teachers union is thinking. Maybe you guys can help me figure that out.
I honestly don't know, other than to say, and we saw this during COVID, Carl, and you and I've talked about this. The teachers unions really did try and take advantage of the situation, and like the LA public schools were demanding things that had nothing to do with COVID. I mean, the idea was, well, we're not going back to work unless we get all these things that are going to make our teachers safe, but they wanted stuff to deal with charter schools. And
the LA Unified School District, their teachers union said, we won't come back to school unless you get rid of charter schools. Now that had nothing to do with health.
Yeah.
Carl, I think in part it's just stupidity. The socialists are stupid. And the terrible thing is these knuckleheads are people who are teaching the children of Chicago. If they can't do math themselves and see that this is ridiculous, then what business do they have teaching our kids? Right? It's just
all
dumb.
right. Listen, I've got about a minute left in this segment, Carl. And do you think there's this idea that, there's reporting that Trump may be trying to do away with the Department of Education, right? How is that going to affect sort of localities and school districts around the country, and the teachers unions themselves, or will it have any effect, do you think?
Well, this is an interesting, very brief history of it. So the Department of Education was created when Jimmy Carter ran for president. He was a little known one-term governor from Georgia. And one of the ways he took traction in Iowa, he's got all these teachers to walk precincts for him. And this had been a dream of the teachers union for decades. He promised them a Department of Education, a federal department, and he delivered on that. He had Democratic Congress. He signed into law. Reagan ran, well, we'll get rid of the Department of Education, but Ronald Reagan didn't care about that one way or the other. And George W. Bush had a whole different thing. He was going to bring the Republican Party in the game and controlling education. There's going to be federal money for education. The cities and states and localities and counties need it now. And nobody's talking about cutting off federal money for education, but it's been good conservative policy, and Richard knows this as well as, knows this well, that the money can go to the states or the school districts directly from the federal government, that we don't need this bureaucratic entity, the Department of Education, to dole out the money and make policy and, pursue what Republicans call woke policies, that the money can just go as block grants to the states, cities, and school districts themselves. If Trump hasn't said this directly, but he's come close.
All right. We are going to leave it there for right now. We're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back with more Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM after this. Welcome back to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP, joined by Richard Porter, contributor to Real Clear Politics and former RNC committeeman from Illinois, and Carl Cannon, our Washington bureau chief and executive editor. So Carl, we are down in Palm Beach, broadcasting live from Palm Beach, because we are going to be hosting our second annual Samizdat Prize. Let's tell our listeners and viewers, what is the Samizdat Prize and why did our Foundation created?
RealClear Foundation created the Samizdat Prize. Samizdat was the underground newspapers in the old Soviet Union. It's a word that meant, underground communications. And the conceit was that we living in a time where freedom of press is under pressure, from very powerful forces, from government and NGOs, and even other journalists who prefer that certain narratives be elevated and others be silenced. And they use various methods to do this. I won't give a whole speech about censorship in America, but the first year we gave the prize to Matt Taibbi, who wrote the Twitter Files, well-known, progressive journalist, by the way, not a conservative at all. Miranda Devine, who wrote The Laptop from Hell. She's a New York Post columnist. She is conservative. She's from Australia. We got to know her last year, Tom. She's a kick-ass journalist, and she wrote about the Hunter Biden laptop. And Jay Bhattacharya, who was censored for, co-writing the Great Barrington Declaration that said on COVID, we were maybe approaching it wrong. And he's a popular professor from Stanford, also not a conservative, but there were moves in the NIH to silence him and at Stanford to silence him. So he's now, by the way, he's now replaced the guy
running the NIH.
Yeah, he's now running the NIH. So that was, I guess we were ahead of the curve there. This year's winners are Linda Vaccarino, who runs X. She's the CEO of X. She probably has the world's hardest personnel job. She reports to Elon Musk. And Abigail Schreier, who wrote a book about exploring whether the transgender policies that if children should be making these decisions. And Jonathan Turley, who journalism professor at Georgetown, who wrote a wonderful book about the First Amendment. And I'm going to introduce him tonight, and I'm basically going to say that book should be required reading in every newsroom in America.
So Richard, he's on fire. Turley's, I think, had such a wonderful impact over the course of the last year, looking at lawfare and some other things. And I know you guys have carried a lot of what he's been writing. I think it's really going to be great to see this. I think you're making this award important by the people you're identifying and recognizing with the award. So.
Well, part of this, Richard, is, as Carl mentioned, I mean, the idea that, and this is part of what RealClearPolitics is all about, right? We try and present, opinions and viewpoints from across the political spectrum, and we will pair them next to each other. Was COVID created? Did it leak from the lab, or did it not? Was it human created? Whatever. I mean, you name the subject, but some of those, that particular example, for example, one side of that argument was declared off limits, and you were smeared and or marginalized if you even suggested as such. And I think that's one of the things as we started this site 25 years ago, and as one of the co-founders, I always enjoyed debate, and that's part of our DNA. I never really envisioned us being in the middle of a free speech battle in America, where I actually thought that, free speech is actually under assault, and that's one of the reasons that we ended up creating this award and honoring these folks, because I think to a lot of folks, they have seen free speech sort of in retreat over the last few years, and it's good to see perhaps that tide might have shifted.
We find truth through the marketplace of ideas, competing opinions, pushing back and forth, and we allow the reader to make judgments and to inform themselves and to see which way is the truth. No side, no ideological side has a monopoly on the truth. It's just the reality. And what RealClearPolitics has created is like the stock exchange of opinion, where you have buyers and sellers, you have left and right, you have opinions coming in, debating on every issue of the day. RealClear is covering it from both sides. And I think the idea that was ever controversial goes right to the heart of what free speech is about. We depend on competing ideas to get to the truth. And RealClear is a place, it is a clearinghouse, for ideas of both sides, so that an informed reader, someone that wants to learn, can come to one place and see the full range of opinion.
Carl, you are going to give a speech tonight, as you said, honoring these folks. And so I'm going to give you the last word here.
Well, Abigail Shrier wrote this book about transgender. I'm not sure I agree with her. The idea among conservatives is that this is a social contagion, and you got adults sort of proselytizing to kids. The other side of that might be that there were just a lot more people like this than we ever realized, and these people should be able to live their lives the best way that they know how. And I'm actually sympathetic to her idea. But what I'm not sympathetic to is the idea that her book would be canceled, that people would say,
Banned.
you can't hear her ideas, that the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, no longer believes in American civil liberties.
Yeah.
That's not good. And if free speech becomes a partisan issue, we are in very deep trouble in this country. And I'll quote, Justice Kennedy, who himself was quoting an earlier justice. The antidote to bad speech is good speech. The antidote to
More
ideas you
speech.
don't like, what?
It's more speech.
Is more speech. And
Yeah.
that's what we believe in RealClearPolitics, and I'm never changing my mind on that.
All right. On that note, we will wrap it up for tonight. On behalf of Richard and Carl, I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. You've been listening to Real Clear Politics on SiriusXM. Everybody have a great night, and we'll see you back here tomorrow. Good night.